So I'm going to be talking today about Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, which finally happened and kind of been on the verge of happening for some time. So it's not a huge shocker, but it was a big deal. Also, going to talk a little an update on the Haskell situation and her nomination to be CIA director. Um, she just had her hearing today, and I personally thought it was a train wreck. The parts I saw. Um, I listened a little to MSNBC, supposedly a liberal channel, and they, you know, didn't seem as convinced that it was a terrible thing. But that was something else. And then I'm going to close out by talking about just West Virginia, in particular, um, the Senate primaries there that just took place on Tuesday. So, just yesterday, Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, and you saw a lot of divergent points of view when it comes to issues of foreign policy, particularly um, issues involving the Middle East. It's a very interesting topic. It's much more complex. So typically, a lot of issues you may have two very divergent points of view, such as abortion. You may have a pro-life and a pro-choice view. Um, most Democrats are pro-choice. Most Republicans are anti-choice, or as they like to call it, pro-life. So um, it's not that simple when it comes to issues like Iran, issues like just foreign policy issues, because you even have schisms within the left and the right. So this is where, for me, the talk about this is always a little complex because I see a lot of different viewpoints and I have some thoughts, but at the same time, there's some issues I'm not 100% sure on. So, for example, on the left, we'll start with the right since they're the bigger bullshitters. Um, you'll have some people on the right who are pretending they want to be isolationists and stay out, and some who legitimately are libertarian about the issue. So they tend to be more anti-interventionist. Then you'll have some people who like to think of themselves as compassionate conservatives, claiming that they want to liberate these countries. But when you pull beyond the veil, it's a lot of national interest, but they talk soft. And then you have the very hardcore neocons who just love war and are pretty open about it. Then on the left, you have varying issues. You have some internationalists on the left who claim about human rights, and who are a little bit more hawkish, kind of a hawkish left. This would be signified by someone like Hillary Clinton or Samantha Power. Then you'll have, on the other side, you may have people who are very much anti-war, but focus primarily on the U.S. Um, and they're anti-U.S. imperialism, which is a very valuable and a good point of view, but almost to the point. Like I see this in Syria. Some people, if you even criticize Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, you almost get turned into some sort of like somebody who wants war. And you're just saying he's a bad dude. And so that's on the other side. Um, and I don't know if they actually feel that way or it's as much of an issue of um, they just don't want to talk about that. And I get that too in some regards because when you're in the U.S., you should be talking about the U.S. So there is something to be said about it, but I don't care for the attacking. Just as the same way I don't care for the idea if you don't support military intervention in Syria, people will call you like an Assad apologist. So I fall in between. And I think a lot of people on the left fall in between on these kind of issues, in between that sort of hardcore internationalist segment that, I don't support these kind of stupid interventions. I think they're not doing us any good. But I also don't know if I go to the point of thinking, for example, that we have to support Assad unconditionally, or in the case of Iran, some people, the issue at hand in there is did Iran actually have a nuclear weapons program to begin with? Now, I don't want to get too much bogged down in that because I've seen there are some suggestions that they did, some they didn't. And I really don't know how I feel about that, truth be told. Um, I wouldn't put it past them to, certainly, and I don't think the government is exactly a good government, albeit it's not. I don't like the terminology of regime either. It's very factionalized. So you have some more hardline factions, some more moderate factions. You can't call that a single entity. But largely, I would still say I'm anti that government. They're not. They're not good. My family members out there, I know there's not good people. It's you have theocratic elements. Granted, you do have elections and a democratic element to it. The top leaders, like the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, these kind of bodies are unelected and they're very clerical in nature, which again I am very against that sort of theocracy in government. And frankly, it's part of the reason I cringe when I see people like Mike Pence and Jerry Falwell Jr. and some of these type of people. To me, it sounds a lot. There's a lot of similarities. I see almost as Christian American hardliners. So, and it really kind of bothers me because I've seen what I mean. I've heard stories about what was in Iran. So my point basically here is there's a lot of nuance in this issue. So you can't simplify it to the point of, all good, all bad. It's just very complex. There are clearly political and human rights and economic issues in Iran, and this can't be forgotten. However, and also the issue of whether or not they have a nuclear program or they ever did have a nuclear weapons program. For example, Benjamin Netanyahu released some evidence and he presented it as being a big new finding. But a lot of that stuff, all that stuff predated the deal. So for me, it's almost as to the point that for this particular issue at hand of the nuclear deal, it doesn't really matter whether they had one or they didn't have one. They agreed to the deal. They had a deal with centrifuges and everything. And that's really what the key issue is. So whether or not you believe it beforehand is very clear to me that Trump pulling out of the deal is just a terrible, terrible move. And it's for a number of reasons. In particular, I think this actually, first of all, this is him giving basically a proverbial blowjob to his great new friends, the Saudis, who interestingly are the purveyors of Wahhabism and that kind of ideology and financing of terrorist attacks like 9/11. So it's a little bit interesting. But when you got oil involved, you're going to sell those guys weapons, even though there's a good chance they're going to be used for either genocide in Yemen to bomb wedding parties, or that money's, they'll use it for holding it over other people's heads, or, they'll end up in the hands of Sunni extremist terrorists. So it's just really messed up. And it's also, he's selling out to Netanyahu and the far right wing of Israel, the far right wing government. And basically, it's a government that envisions basically kicking out all the Palestinians. They have an apartheid system now, and they're trying to expand that system. So I always cringe a little when I hear about Israel being the Middle East only democracy. Yeah, within the rulers, they have elections, they have a traditional democratic idea. But are we just going to forget about, all the people in the West Bank and in Gaza? That just strikes me as oddly convenient. I don't think we would do that in many other places in the world. So this is Trump kind of selling out to being a puppet for these guys, being kind of a go-between. And that's even why that Netanyahu presentation came to pass. It was a lot of uses, big lettering, PowerPoints, pictures, because it was almost a setup. Netanyahu did this stuff because there's an audience of Trump, and Trump likes big letters, and because he's a fucking child, has to have things done this way. So they set up this way. So then the substance of this being all before the deal is irrelevant. So with regards to that, the nuclear deal was working. Iran had stopped its nuclear program, whether it was for peaceful or military, is irrelevant. They stopped it. They said, okay, we're going to stop. There was some sanctions released, some of their own money. This was their money that had been frozen by the West, and correctly so. But they, as part of the deal, they unfroze it. They gave it. It wasn't us giving taxpayer money to the Iranians. It was their own money, letting them have it, with the understanding that money would go in and help the economy. Now, the helping the economy has been limited. It's been slow to take effect, and I'll get back to that in a second. But this was essentially the deal, and there were robust inspections, and this was to make sure that if they were working on a nuclear weapon, they would not be able to get there. And it was for 10 to 15 years, and that the idea being in that time, give Iran a chance to join the community of nations, give some chance for some normalization of relations, some modernization, hopefully down the line be able to work on the human rights and political issues, work on the issue of their support for certain militia groups like militant groups like Hezbollah, and issues like this. And the idea being also would help the more moderate factions, which in fact it did, because the president is now more relatively moderate versus a more hardline candidate, was more open to relations with the West, the foreign minister as well. So in that regard, it was working. Now, it wasn't perfect, and all the economic stuff hadn't really come to pass yet, so there were some issues in that regard. But the worst possible thing you could have done is pull out. One, that tells me, you're not really that interested in peace. You just want to start a war, because that's what the Saudis and the Israelis want. They're worried about Iran's power growing, which ironically came out of our attacking Iraq, and because Saddam was a counterbalance to the Iranians, and basically we did them a big favor by taking out Saddam. So we stuck our paws into a messy area where, frankly, there are no good leaders. Okay, it'd be nice if there are good leaders, but every bad leader in the world we can't overthrow. It just doesn't work. I mean, look, if that's the case, we got to go overthrow Saudi Arabia. We got to overthrow Iran. We got to overthrow the Philippines. We got to overthrow Brazil. We got to overthrow all these countries. And then on top of that, we may have to overthrow our own guy. So it doesn't work that way. You got to let the people decide. And, they got to make a decision. But what the nuclear deal was doing that was actually somewhat effective, and it's not even just a nuclear deal. It's more of the opening of discussions and, semi-normal relations with Iran. It was allowing them to come into the community of nations and make the point to the people of Iran that, hey, if you open up, there will be benefits. Now, not all those benefits have trickled through, but because we had done the deal and that excuse could be pulled away, and then that created pressure on the government. So there had been some economic protests recently because Iran's economy had not been growing at the level that was expected, and that's fine. I mean, that's how societies work. When the economy is bad, you're going to have a lot of protests. So rather than letting the things work out, continue talking to Iran, seeing if there can be more sanctions relief, or we keep the status quo, and letting a better, issue. And if they ever broke the deal, or in 10 years, if they came out and did it anyways, we would say, hey, we tried our best. What can we do? I mean, then we would have more support. Now, Trump pulls us out of this deal. Now we're the bad guys. We're the guys who pulled it, who violated the deal. We're the violators. And that's something that can't be denied. Iran, by all sources, I mean, from the UN to the IEA to the Europeans to even people in Trump's own administration, like the Secretary of Defense and the new Secretary of State, they had been in compliance with the deal. So now when you pull out, even some Republicans are criticizing it. It's like, dude, this is not a good strategy. The cat's out of the bag. Whether you agreed with the deal or not, it's there. So by pulling it out, you look like a petulant child. You didn't accomplish anything except make about four groups in the world happy. Basically, the four groups being Netanyahu, hard right neocons in the U.S., the Gulf states, Saudi, UAE, some of these places, and essentially the some of the Iranian dissidents in the U.S., and even not most by any stretch. Basically, it's just the MEK, which is a fringe terrorist group, terrorist death cult, basically, of just nuts. They're out of their mind, and and they get some influence because they give money to people like Howard Dean and Rudy Giuliani on both sides of the aisle. So these are the people we've made happy, and we don't. And it's just the same old song and dance. We did what we did in Iraq. We destabilized a lot of shit. ISIS came to pass. We made the Iranians stronger, actually. Um, just all these different things we did, and we didn't accomplish anything. All right, great. Saddam was a bad fucking guy, but what do we do? Now we want to go in and do the same thing against a country who is exponentially stronger, who may well have support from countries like Russia and China, and they trade a lot even with, India and Pakistan. So this is not a Iraq situation. I mean, this is a country of 60 million people. This is not going to be nice, and a lot of people are going to die who don't need to die. So hopefully, cooler heads prevail. Um, Hopefully, they can turn Trump around this, but I'm not that hopeful when you have people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo in there. So time will tell what happens. It's still early days, but it was just incredibly irresponsible, naive, foolish move by someone who just doesn't seem to have an understanding of you can't treat, international diplomacy like you do real estate in New York, where you can go blackmail people like is what he does. He just goes around blackmails and pulls out of deals. Doesn't work that way. You're pulling out of Paris. You're pulling out of uh, the Iran deal. You're pulling out of all these deals. People are saying, okay, you're a rogue nation. So we'll see what happens. Now we got issues of just tonight. Last night, Israel bombed Syria, and now tonight there's more exchange between Israel and Syria, and there's conflicting reports about some Iranian forces in Syria involved in it. It's not good. Like things are just getting very out of hand, and it looks like Trump's just giving the green light to all his allies in that region to just lose their damn minds. So we'll see what happens. I still tend to think Iran probably won't directly attack Israel because, I mean, it's not good for them. They want to survive. They want to keep going. So, but what it means, I feel like there's going to be a major rally around the flag. When these things happen, you can actually help a lot of the more right-wing radical elements in Iran. And that's unfortunate too, because I think what we need to be doing really is, opening up normal relationships. Look, and I'll say, I wish there was a way I could snap my fingers and all these bad governments could be replaced by good leaders. It does, but it doesn't work that way. We got to be realistic in our foreign policy. We got to understand that, there are going to be bad people we have to work with out there. So what we should be doing is normalizing relations and using that nuclear deal and eventually creating some leverage and also letting that sanction relief come in, because then the people will see, will the money come to us and help the economy? If it doesn't, then they can't always look at the US or Europe to blame. They'd have to look to their own leaders and say, okay, where the fuck's the money? Why is it not trickling down? Why are you going fighting these wars? The same stories that you say here. They say, why are you sending money into Syria to fight this when I can't, afford food for my family? I can't get a job. The economy's faltering. It's the same idea that we have here, for example. You can't get good, clean water in Flint, Michigan. So why are you sending money out to the Middle East to fight these kind of battles? So it could actually work to our advantage. And on top of that, we open up business to get into Iran. I think that would also help. And other countries, they would expose them to a little little Western, business and culture, and see how that works out. But this kind of playing hard ass is not going to accomplish anything. We learned you can't count on a bunch of weird ass dissidents start a war, overthrow a country, then bring in some weird ass dissidents like they tried with Chalabi in Iraq, because the people don't know it. So ultimately, what we got to do is facilitate the deal, and we would have to keep working with them on the other issues and see if we can come to some agreements and allow the people. Ultimately, the people of Iran have to make those decisions. Okay, it can't be us who make it for them. And from everything I've seen, they're not interested in starting a bloody coup at this point in time. I mean, there are protests with the economy, and where that would have gone, who knows? And there are gradual changes happening, but unless the people are willing to rise up and start attacking the people with guns and shedding a lot of blood, it's not going to happen. So I think sometimes a lot of people think we got to be the world's policeman. We got to go around doing this, but it's selective because you don't hear them talking about, they want to talk about Yemeni bombs landing in Riyadh or in Saudi, but you don't hear them talking about Saudi planes dropping bombs on wedding parties and killing brides and grooms to be and their wedding guests. So there's a double standard, and it's just we're being ridiculous. You don't hear them talking about all the people living as not even second class citizens, but not citizens at all, under the power of an occupying force. So we have to understand these things. This is not an appropriate way to go about diplomacy. There's no good that can come out of it in the short term. So hopefully cooler heads prevail. Really, war is not an option. And if the march to war starts, we got to be ready to go out in the streets and make Trump hear us. So that's my thoughts on that. In turn with that, is today was the Gina Haspel hearing for CIA director. Gina Haspel has been a long time CIA agent, and after 9/11 was in charge of CIA black site and had a direct hand in torture, and more so even destroying some tapes of torture. Now, some people want to call it enhanced interrogation or waterboarding. If you see the videos of this shit, it's torture, okay? It just is. And this cuts right to the core of what we like to think about America, why we think we're the best country in the world. This whole notion of American exceptionalism is part of that is we don't torture. And unfortunately, that's broken and gone. And, these people who are involved, you can say they were following orders and whatnot. Doesn't matter. They can't come back into government. Obama shouldn't have done it either, honestly. But it's even more concerning with someone like Trump, because Trump actually actively supports torture. So if you want to put in cowards, people who, when the going got tough, could not turn down, or it's hard. Maybe in that position, I wouldn't do the same thing, but I shouldn't be CIA director either. So they couldn't turn down the order. So what if Trump does that? We know Trump already likes the idea of, bombing, families of suspected terrorists. So who's to say he's not, and he loves the idea of torture. So who's to say he won't go to Haskell as much as she can give assurances and stuff? She's not Trump. Trump goes there and says she has a history of already not being capable of not listening. So it's a terrible idea. So far, I've seen most Democrats are against, and I've been actually pleasantly surprised with the number of Democrats who have actually opposed it. So much credit to those opposing. I've seen most Republicans obviously for. There are some exceptions each way. John McCain just came out against, and I don't like to speak ill of the dying, so I'm going to keep this brief. I'm not a fan of John McCain for many, many reasons. I think he's a very overrated figure. Now, that's not to say his history and the torture as a soldier. I'm talking as a politician, he's overrated. Having said that, this is one of the few issues that he's very good on. And he's been consistent, the issue of torture with regards to this specific subset of torture by the U.S. So he came out and gave a very good statement. I mean, he wouldn't be able to vote anyways because of his condition right now. But to his credit, he came out strongly against this nomination, urging people to say reject it. So that's one Republican down. Rand Paul had previously said, "I'm interested to see if he's actually going to keep his spine, because like a little spineless coward, he rolled over on Pompeo, which if I were a libertarian, I'd be irate." So let's see what he does with the Haskell situation. He wanted to oppose. Whether he continues to oppose, time will tell. On the Democrat side, we already have Diamond Joe Manchin. We'll get to a little later. A real despicable, disgusting character in his own right. Who has already come out in support. Because Joe Manchin is the kind of Democrat that likes torture. He hates America. He hates the Constitution. He hates what's supposed to be our ideals. Now, God knows we're flawed. But he's the type of guy that, he has a D next to his name, but that's about the extent of it. All right? He's done one or two decent things on not voting to take out Obamacare and things like that, but he is what he is. I mean, it's just, that this is the best they can do. I'm at the point, basically, I don't even care if he loses to a Republican, because, and maybe that's a stupid thing to say, but like 2 or 3 things he seems to get right, and everything else. I'm not trying to say you got to be a purist, and I know West Virginia is a tough state for Democrats, so I get it. I really do. That he might have to buck the trend on certain issues, and it's a little frustrating. But this guy literally does it on almost everything. This isn't even that hard. I don't understand what voting against Gina Haskell is going to do. Do people in West Virginia like torture? No. So the whole thing is horseshit. We'll see what happens if any more Democrats. It's just this faulty notion that I have to be moderate. I already spoke about it in one of my prior videos, so I'm not going to get too much into that. But Ezra, because all they call it, I just look at him, I call him Diamond Joe Manchin, kind of an ode to The Simpsons' Joe Quimby, the mayor, who is also kind of sleazy. So it's just, hopefully we'll see what happens. Seems like some Republicans will be interested to see what happens with a couple of the other moderate Republicans, and if the Democrats can keep their caucus outside of Diamond Joe intact. So time will tell. Hopefully we get this out, because we can't be doing this stuff. We want to call ourselves the greatest country in the world. We can't be torturing. I know it's tough when you're dealing with with these terrorists, these guys who are real vicious. I get, but we got to be above the fray in that regard. And we still got to fight them and do that. I'm not saying don't. This isn't a pacifist argument, honestly. I'm not a pacifist, but we gotta, keep to some of our ideals. Otherwise, the terrorists have already won. So that's how I feel about that. We'll see what happens in the days to come on both of those issues, and hopefully things will turn out okay. Some good stuff happening in North Korea, and we'll see. I hope Trump succeeds in that. And we're talking with Kim Jong-il and having the summit, and I hope they can come to an agreement, because we don't want to have a war with North Korea either. So I'm not one to give Trump a lot of credit for much. And I think this was frankly more of the South Korean president, who's more of a dove, who's more of a negotiator. To his credit, he's done a lot of good stuff. But, Trump has, for whatever part he has done, credit to him. We have to give credit sometimes to even those we oppose if, they're doing it. And I hope they succeed, because that's good for all of us. So I just wanted to touch on one final point, and it has to do with Joe Manchin. There were some primaries yesterday, and I thought it was very interesting what had happened in the West Virginia Senate race. And West Virginia, to me, is a very fascinating landscape. I had to take a quick break. Something came up. So I was talking to West Virginia Senate race. So the primaries are on Tuesday, and one thing you saw if you looked in the media, almost all the coverage was on the Republican side, where you had two kind of establishment-y characters, the Attorney General and a Congressman, and then you had a very Trump, Roy Moore type far right wing candidate in terms of Don Blankenship. So he was actually recently in jail for he was a CEO of a coal mining company. He neglected safety standards and many of these things, and there was a big explosion a few years back, and 29 miners died. So this is the type of guy that he is, and he just also during his campaign was very racist. I highly recommend looking at some of his his um, his campaign ads because they were like almost freaking parodies. Like you would look at this and think this ain't real. So the guy was just a terrible, terrible human being. Um, and all you had all the talk on that side about this. And fine, I understand you should cover that, but it was just only that side. And on the Democratic side, it was assumed that Diamond Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat literally in name only, is really just a Republican. Pretty right wing in most issues. A few issues, he bucks the trend and votes with his party, which is a weird statement actually. But so he is, very corporate minded Democrat, very hawkish, very pro business, pro coal, likes polluting the water, likes poisoning children type of Democrat. But obviously very well funded, gets all the media attention, is assumed and seen as a deal maker, as a governing coalition member, kind of a no labels kind of guy. If you ever seen No Labels, this is some idiotic organization that they stuck out. We don't have labels. We just want to govern and unify. And it's completely a useless mentality, honestly. Look, I'm all for unity. I'm all for bipartisanship. I'm all for civility. But those should not be the number one, two, and three priorities, okay? The number one priority should be good policy. If you want to govern, what's the point of governing if you have bad policy? What's the point of unifying if you're unifying behind bad policy? What's the point of being civil if your civil policy is, uh, you know, supports things like police brutality, like poisoning the waters, like crappy pipes, like, giving arms to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen? Well, then your civility doesn't do any good. So this is the kind of guy Joe Manchin is. But he's seen as that kind of guy, so he's popular. So he had a primary challenger, although you would never know it because almost none of the media talked about it. I saw one really good article in Rolling Stone about it, but that was the extent for this election. But there was he had a competitor from kind of a populist left angle, so more left wing than him, but at the same time, you're not going to have a pure socialist one. So it's kind of like a populist left, very union friendly, wanting to bulk up the unions, want to get some infrastructure, want to get jobs, but maybe not the same coal jobs. So, but it was her name was Paula Jean Swearengin. So it's activist, very first time candidate, just a normal person, normal job. I want to say teacher, but maybe I'm wrong about that, so don't hold me. But normal job, not some sort of fancy corporate lawyer or something like that. Rich, not rich at all, just a standard person, a real human being, so to speak. And despite all those hurdles, she managed to get in West Virginia, which is seen as the antithesis of left-wing politics. She managed to get 30%. Which, when you don't have any media or coverage or any money, I mean, you're only taking small donations. You're not taking millions of dollars from corporations and corporate PACs. That's not that bad. That's really damn impressive, actually. And it was because she went around in retail politics. You took 30% off Manchin. But there's also something you said there. Now, I always thought when Hillary Clinton made a deplorable comment about Trump supporters, it was something that was always torn up. Because in one sense, there's a segment of Trump supporters who are absolutely deplorable, who are irredeemable. They're not coming back. They have allowed their belief in white supremacy to the point that they will vote against their interests. They will vote for people who will kill their brother who's a coal miner. So, and which is what was actually happening. People had family members killed in the coal line, and they were voting for Blankenship. So there are people that are beyond the point of redeeming, and there's just so much racial animosity that those people, they're going to be what they are. But if you can get to a point where you're not losing 80-20, I don't think the breakdown is 80% racist, or at least to the level of it. There might be a racial aspect, but a lot of these people also voted for Obama, or enough voted for Obama. So what you have to do is get the people you can get, the people who just don't have a job. And when Trump came and said, I'm going to give you a job, is that you got to bring left-wing populism, left-wing solutions to them. You guys tell them, we're going to give you a strong union who will fight for collective bargaining. We're not going to just ship your jobs overseas with one-sided trade deals. But if we do see some outsourcing or some automation, we're going to give you some money. We're going to put in some money there to the infrastructure and for job retraining and things like that. And at the same time, we're also going to make sure your kids are in schools, not next to dirty factories polluting the air and water. And you made a real good case there. But there's no interest. The interest is in, I got to be in the center. It's very poli-sci. I actually took a little bit of poli-sci in college, and the idea is if you're more closer to the center of, versus left versus or right wing, you have a better chance of winning elections. Very old-time traditional theory. That theory doesn't work anymore. There was a time it did, but as the victory of Trump has proven, that doesn't work. So unless you got a guy who's like a pedophile or who's a murderer like Blankenship and Moore, you're not going to have that. So you got to give these issues to them. You got to fight it out. Okay? You got to say you're going to help you also on the opioid stuff. There are some issues that you can do. You can retail politics. Now, this again, not to say you're going to have a socialist necessarily winning in West Virginia, but you could have some strain of an old style Democratic populism. And a lot of those places still have a ton of registered Democrats. Right? There are a lot of registered Democrats down there because traditionally they are historically Democratic because they want the strong union. So again, I'm not saying they can win the area, but you can get a decent percentage to a point that you won't lose your election. For example, in a state like Pennsylvania, where I'm from, Obama ran up the numbers in Philly and the Philly suburbs, and he won enough of the rural vote. Now, it wasn't great, 30, 35, 40%. Not great, but, enough. So he'd win enough of those kind of economic anxiety voters. Unfortunately, there are a lot of deplorable voters there too. You're not going to get them. So this is where I always come back to the idea that there's a racial identity, there's a racial identity, a sexism. All these things are real and things that cannot be set aside. They are absolutely essential. We have to understand. We have to fight those. We have to work to fix those. But there are also some economic and class-based issues too. And this is why I have just a disdain for the idea of only looking at one or only looking at the other. They both have a lot of value. Without one, the other would exist. In a sense, I think the racial aspect is much worse because it just makes your skin crawl. Like, people are people. So it's at a human level very disgusting. But at the same time, we have to look at the class aspect too. So Obama will win enough of them. So it means they're redeemable. But Hillary couldn't even win 20% in some of these places. And that made a difference because she also wasn't exciting enough people in the Democratic strongholds. So I don't want to rehash the election, but just say these are realities of the election. We got to look at, improving and fighting in every state with candidates that can fit the district, of course, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're centrist or they're corporate friendly. I don't think those people really give a damn about if you're voting for Gina Haskell. They are anti-fighting. They're anti-environmental regulations in West Virginia, primarily because they see coal as their only way of making money. You give them another way, then they won't care as much because they know it's poison in the water too. But you got to choose between taking a risk with poison water, or if you don't want any money, there's no chance you're going to be able to feed your family. So it's just something that the fact that she was able to really work really hard, put it out there, and get 30% without with incredible barriers to entry, is damn impressive. And I hope she sticks around and keeps doing that sort of runs again in another election. And I hope that there are many people like that. And I hope that continues because I think we need to see a kind of a left revival in some of these areas. Again, maybe you don't win it, but at least you get enough that you can you're not going to, lose it, so to speak. So we'll see what happens with that. There are a lot of primaries still to go. Pennsylvania primaries coming up soon, so still waiting for my absentee ballot. But it'll be another one, and then the midterms coming up, so keep an eye and see what happens. So that's all I got for tonight. I know it went a little long, but not going to apologize for that. So I like talking. So I'll be back soon and be keeping an eye in the world and the real events, and we'll see what happens. So thanks. Have a good night.